So welcome to the Association's Unplugged podcast powered by Kellen. Today we're joined by Teresa Scardigli, Managing Director of Kellen, and Wouter Vermeulen, Director of Sustainability and Public Policy at Coca-Cola. So we're going to have a very interesting conversation about leadership at associations today. But before we get into that, I want to turn to Teresa. I'm very keen to understand why you wanted to start a podcast about associations.
Thank you, Paul. Actually, the idea of starting a podcast is really because we wanted to have give a specific angle to this podcast. And the angle is, on one side, to give the insight from the corporate world, that because corporations are primarily member of trade association, industry trade association, and on the other side, also to give the perspective of the secretariat and the executive director of the trade association, and then really giving the voice of these two elements. On one side, the trade association, on the other side, the corporation, is really our key differentiator in relation to this podcast. We also realized that there was a need for a content-driven podcast really on strategic management of trade association, but also what are the expectations, opportunities, and challenges that the members of a trade association face and need to address through a trade association. So really, the podcast is divided into two parts. One is a dialogue between a representative of Kellen, in this case today is myself, and a corporate representative. And thank you, Wouter, for joining us today. And the second part is around 20 minutes, is an exchange between an executive director of a trade association and yourself as the host of this association Unplugged.
Great. I think it's worth stressing as well that we're in Europe. And I think there are lots of association podcasts in the US and other parts of the world, but maybe not so much on this side of the Atlantic. Was that part of the thinking behind setting this up as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. We can be the first, in any case, one of the first in launching a podcast on European Trade Association. What are the key topics and themes that, from a strategic point of view, could be facilitated through this podcast and through dialogue between corporation on one side and association representative on the other side.
Fine. And so today we're talking about leadership, finding the leadership track at associations that's relevant to the secretariat, relevant to the members as well, looking at this from both sides. I'm going to leave this to you now. You can start this discussion with Wouter. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Paul. Wouter, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today to this first episode.
With pleasure.
Really focus on leadership. I know that you have a lot of experience as a Coca-Cola representative in Brussels, but also in Europe and at global level in engaging with trade association. And I think your insight will be very interesting for our audiences. So the first question I have really is, what is the added value that a company or a corporation expects from a trade association, I would say, beyond the specificity of the trade association in Europe?
Sure. Thanks, MT. And that's a great question. And I think the starting point should be, inside a company, how do you reflect on the role of public policy and how do you engage as a company in the broadest sense? And obviously, engagement is done as a company, through your trades, through other, coalitions that you may develop, but the starting point should always be, how do you engage on public policy frameworks? How are they relevant to the business? What is ultimately the value that you expect to derive from engaging on enabling public policy frameworks? So even before we can start expecting things from trade associations, I do think it is important for every company to be clear on its public affairs strategy and how that is being organized. And obviously, you would expect from any trade association excellence at the technical level in terms of, providing the right insights, providing insights timely, establishing the right contacts with the people that matter. But I also think trade associations play an important role to help educate, if you wish, companies and executives in terms of how the external environment and the public policy context is changing rapidly, the volatility in that sector, and trying to make that relevant for the business. So trade associations help companies implement their public affairs strategy, but companies can also learn and derive value from engaging with and through trade associations.
Thank you, Wouter. That's really key insight, actually, also for trade association professionals to really understand how they can act or react within a trade association to support better the members. In terms maybe of leadership in a trade association, how do you see, what are the skills, or maybe how do you see leadership? What does leadership mean for you, for a corporation within a trade association?
Right. Well, to put it black and white, one could argue that some trade associations are actually more focused on finding the lowest common denominator amongst the members. And I think, that may have served a certain purpose in the past. But I think, expectations change dramatically. Companies are actually required to also align their sustainability work with their public policy work. So that's why at Coca-Cola Europe, we have actually brought 2 teams together, and I have the pleasure of leading them. So being clear on that strategic intent, how public policy can align with long-term sustainability goals. And that will then actually request from our trade associations a similar thinking. And, we have the Olympic Games next year. Some trade associations would always qualify for a medal in the competition saying no. We need to move from saying no to being for something. So back to your question on what does leadership mean, is actually associations that help the industry to evolve from a risk-averse and closed-door approach to embracing change, embracing the push to be for solutions, and to open the doors and engage with all relevant stakeholders.
It's really great. Actually, it's one of the reasons why I love to work with trade associations, really being proactive. If you have a piece of advice to an executive director of a secretariat on how we in a trade association can support a corporation or all the other members, whether that's a large, medium, or small size enterprise, what that would be as a piece of advice?
We only have 10 minutes, so, I could continue to ramble on, but maybe 1 or 2 reflections that come spontaneously to mind. And it all starts from delivering value to the business, right? And so trade associations should not expect senior leaders to be experts in EU comitology, but rather, work around the reverse, and so be audience-centric, and as a trade association understand that the people, and definitely as you work with senior leaders, have limited time to engage on EU affairs, and make that as relevant as possible, as easy to understand as possible, and as meaningful as possible for what those senior leaders need to deal with every day, which is the business reality, and ensuring that a company like ours that has been around for 137 years, we want to be around for another 137 years at least. So how does actually public policy engagement and understanding that broader societal and regulatory context is going to deliver value for the business on the midterm and long term?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Wouter, for being with us today.
Thanks for the invite.
Welcome to the second part of our first Associations Unplugged podcast, which is powered by Kellen. We've already had a very insightful discussion with Wouter Vermeulen from Coca-Cola about how members see leadership at associations. And now it's the turn of the Secretariat. And I'm delighted to introduce Paul Voss, Director General at European Aluminium. Paul, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So Paul, I was wondering, when you were younger, did you dream or envision working at associations?
I think I wanted to be a footballer, but somewhere along the line it became clear that wasn't going to happen. And no, I had a little bit of experience with associations early on in my career as a consultant, and then as a kind of junior staff member. And then I left to work in a large company, and I probably thought I would stay and grow up there. And then frankly, for personal reasons, because I wanted to be in Brussels more and traveling around the world a lot less, because I had a young family at the time and so on, I kind of ended up taking over an association, if I'm really frank about it. And the thing is, I loved it. I probably wasn't expecting to, probably at the time saw it as a kind of professional sacrifice for personal reasons, but I absolutely loved it, and here I am.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is very common. I think most people get into associations by accident. Yeah. But I have the impression it's something that suits you, maybe because it's linked to a mission, and that's something that's important for you to have.
Yeah, I think it probably does. First thing is the scale of it suits me. The company I worked at before association work had 40 or 50,000 employees. And to be fair to them, it was a great company. I really enjoyed myself there. It wasn't a problem. But when I moved, the first association that I started managing had 12, 13 staff when I got there. And I loved it because I knew something about each one of those people.
Yeah.
We had a purpose and they had a purpose as individuals. And the place was so tiny that I could know something about each one of those stories, and something I really like.
Yeah. So we're talking about leadership in this podcast, and that can cover all sorts of different topics. At associations, there's leadership of the staff, leadership of the members, maybe even being a leader within the industry that you're representing. I'd like to start by talking about leadership of a board and how you manage that. And somebody told me before that if you're in an association, you need to make sure that you lead the board and not be led by the board. And I think that's easier said than done. So I was wondering if you agree with that and how you go about creating this type of dynamic.
Sure. I absolutely agree with that. First of all, I think that the best associations are led by the secretariat, because otherwise, well, you were talking about the sense of mission, the sense of purpose that the team has. I think if you get yourself in a state of mind where you're simply there to execute and you really behave like a secretariat in the strictest sense of the term, it's less exciting. And I think, the reason people like me are given jobs and asked to put teams together is because we're supposed to know what we're doing. We're supposed to know how to operate in Brussels. We're supposed to know how to look after our members' best interests. Now, in order to be able to do that, you need the confidence of the people who employ you, because in the end, we're a service organization. So we're here to deliver for them. But you need to have the trust of these people that you know how best to go about doing that. And that's, so much of this job in the end is just relationships, managing relationships with your colleagues and with your board. From the minute that these people believe in you and believe that you, A, know what you're doing, and B, are really committed to the mission, I find they understand quite easily and naturally that you need to be given space to make decisions, and it works out better for everybody that way.
Yeah. Because you do work for them.
You do. Of course you do.
They're paying your wages. Yeah. And that's why it can be hard, I think, to find the balance.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you lose sight of that, you get yourself into all sorts of trouble. A secretariat makes no sense at all without the support and engagement of the industry and the people that it represents. But that doesn't mean that you're there to kind of blindly follow orders. I think somebody in my job and the colleagues that I work with, we have a responsibility to our membership to not only offer execution, but guidance and leadership.
One part of this is aligning members to come up with a strong and consistent position. And I think there can be a danger that you would go for the path of least resistance and come up with a vanilla position that really represents the lowest common denominator within the industry. How do you manage that?
I think it comes down to remembering what you're there to do. If you allow your fundamental purpose to be reaching agreements internally, that might sound funny, but you do see plenty of cases like that where the point of the association seems to be its own internal management. Then you will end up with nonsense as positions and as an approach to advocacy, because you're not really adding any value to the policy debate, and that is, what we're there for. So you need to have your membership understand that it's in their best interest for you to have something interesting and meaningful to say, and I think that helps encourage the members around the table to maybe push themselves and their own organizations a little further and leave the comfort zone of just saying, well, this is how we see things. This is what my company wants, and that's the end of it. Yeah. And that there's necessarily an element of compromise here and a kind of obligation to let go of some of your individual ability to decide things. You pooling your sovereignty a little bit in the name of the greater influence that you can have when you act as a group.
Is this about convincing the members about how the association can be effective?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably end up saying this 10 times. I think it comes down to making sure that they trust us as a team. From the minute you have that, my experience has been that people are much more ready to be led, much more open to different ways of thinking about things. If they don't think you know what you're doing, you're in real trouble.
Yeah. I was wondering as well if there's a shift that's taken place where it might have been possible before to have that lowest common denominator decision-making approach, to have an approach where associations were often just saying no to things. We don't want this regulation. This doesn't work for us. Whereas that approach doesn't make sense anymore. And what you're looking for is associations that can be proactive and make a strong contribution to the policy making.
Yeah, my experience is that the interlocutors that we have on the institutional side, they expect a bit more from us than that. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, yeah, we get paid to defend a narrow industrial interest. That's a fact. But that doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't bring a bit more to the table, that we shouldn't be a stakeholder with something meaningful to contribute to what are fundamental, very important discussions about the kind of society we want to live in, whether it's energy or industry or climate. These things matter, and I think we owe it to ourselves and the partners that we work with to push ourselves to do a little bit better than just stamping our feet and saying no to everything.
Yeah. I mean, another part of associations as well, you see this element of trying to take a long-term view, whereas members sometimes will be constrained by short-term concerns and so on, and I think that's important. But you started at European Aluminium, I think, in February 2022.
Correct.
You had a very brief honeymoon period where you could focus on some of those long-term issues, maybe like the environment, decarbonization.
About 12 working days.
12 working days. Then the invasion of Ukraine started.
Yeah.
And I guess you were in crisis management mode there then.
Yeah, I mean, I probably tried not to think of it in those terms, but looking back in practice, that's exactly what it was. I mean, we were dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And I mean, there was enough uncertainty to start with because I there's so much that I didn't know.
Yeah.
There's still so much that I don't know. But at that time, I mean, I didn't come from the aluminium industry. I didn't come from the metal business. So it was a really intense period, a very, very steep learning curve, those first few weeks and months. Yeah.
But I guess quite quickly you would have been on the front line.
Yep.
Looking for support for the industry.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we had to. It was pretty clear. I mean, energy was, depending on whether you're talking about gas or electricity, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times more expensive than it had been. And we are fundamentally an energy intensive business.
Yeah.
So things got quite existential quite quickly.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of, I mean, the best thing I can say about it is it left me in no doubt as to what my purpose and mission was. In those months, we were really talking about how to save this industry. The good thing is I think there's always a link between these short-term interests and the longer-term picture, because fundamentally, I really believe that this industry will be necessary to build the sustainable energy system that we want to have in the future. And I think that system and its constituent elements should, to a large extent, be built here in Europe. So I didn't have to choose between a long-term vision and short-term survival. Yeah. I said, if you want this long-term vision to be made real, we need to survive in the short term.
All of a sudden, it just became immediately relevant.
It was a bit, there were a lot of flashing red lights, yeah.
Yeah. You said that you didn't know much about the aluminium sector before you began. Does that mean that you can be successful as a trade association executive without the subject matter expertise, or you just had to learn very quickly?
I'm in the really privileged position of having a big team and a talented team. So we are a bit more than 30 people, and there is no shortage of knowledge and experience of the sector inside the secretariat and obviously in the membership, but even within the team itself, I'm really blessed to work with some of these people. I mean, so I leaned on them heavily. Where I could add value was maybe having an external perspective on the way the association was performing, the way it was behaving. Also, I came from the energy sector, and aluminium inevitably is all bound up with energy, and especially in times of crisis like we were going through. So I could lean on my networks and contacts and friends in the energy business to help. And I was glad of that because I could make myself useful in those early months.
Yeah.
It would have been, I worried about not being able to help enough given how serious things were, but I found ways to make myself useful. And I think if you have the right people around you, you can be effective without knowing everything about the subject.
Great. You didn't have moments of imposter syndrome?
I don't have time for that. I didn't spend time thinking about that at all. I just thought, okay, who do I need to talk to learn about this? And again, I was and am lucky to have really great people around me.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about that as well is that you had the opportunity to think more broadly about aluminium. You're not just talking about the metal. You're not just talking about the technical elements. You're talking about European industrial policy. You're talking about European social policy. And that might have been as a result of being in that crisis. But do you think it's important anyway to link what you're doing at the association to those broader issues?
It's the whole reason I took the job. When I was approached about it for the first time, if I'm honest, I'd never given aluminium any thought whatsoever. I mean, I used it in my daily life, I'm sure, like everybody else, but it's not something I went to bed thinking about. But when I started to look into it and started to consider it, I realized that the subject's not really just aluminium at all, but the question of whether you can reconcile the work that needs to be done on climate and sustainable energy with the maintenance of a strong industrial base in Europe. And that's a mission. That's interesting. It's not really about the aluminium, if I'm honest. I mean, our organization wouldn't exist if there weren't the specific question of aluminium and the need to safeguard the sector's interests. And of course, you can't lose sight of that, but there has to be more to it than that. These things, I mean, aluminium doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of a much wider ecosystem of policy concerns. And making it about something bigger than your own particular sector, I think, helps make other people interested in what you have to say.
And that probably goes for every topic that's covered by an association, no matter how arcane or obscure.
I think so. Yeah. Sure. I mean, whatever you're representing, inevitably, most people aren't going to be that interested in it. But there are principles and ideas attached to these things that should be of interest to a much wider audience. And I think finding those ideas and principles and using those to generate discussion around your particular set of concerns, I think that works.
Yeah. So you had that sort of crisis management moment, and maybe that has settled down somewhat, but I would imagine there is still a great deal of pressure on the industry that you're representing. In those early days, were there other things that you wanted to do at the association, that you wanted to bring to the association, maybe at an operational level, the way you work with the staff and so on? So how did you approach that while having to manage the crisis at the same time?
Yeah, we did both. I mean, by nature, a person who's interested in building stuff, really. And a job like this, it's a project. It's not just about you as an individual. I mean, it's not really about that at all, but it's about the organization, the community around it, how it functions. And I spent the first kind of 60 days in the job split between the kind of crisis management you've just described on one hand, and on the other, looking at the organization, how it works, what was good, what was less good, and thinking about each individual person in that office. Because in the end, I mean, my first job really is to look after the people that I work with, because this is really not just about me. The organization doesn't go very far if my colleagues aren't engaged and happy and focused. And I did a lot of restructuring process and people and structure, and kind of redefining our purpose and mission even in the first 2-3 months. So they were very busy, intense times, but I mean, it's in a way, it's the most fun period.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you reach a point where, and I'm not sure we're there just yet, but you reach a point where you have things kind of the way you like. And normally I end up feeling a bit nostalgic for the early days when the whole thing felt a bit more like a construction site.
Yeah, it's very interesting. At associations, I think there can be the danger that you get sucked into the membership management, and I mean that is what you're there for to a certain extent. But if you don't manage it well, I think it can consume a lot of time, a lot of energy and resources. And you wonder, are we the administration association or are we the Aluminium association sort of thing?
Yeah.
Is that something that you encountered?
Yes. I don't think anyone will mind me saying this. In my first weeks, there were moments where I literally turned my colleagues physically around and pointed them out the window towards some of the institutional buildings where we need to be working and said, these are the people we need to be talking to. Of course, we need to engage with our membership, but the opportunity cost of time spent in circular discussions internally is enormous. I mean, we are an advocacy organization. Membership management, it's kind of a means to an end. You know, you need to get the members aligned and organized so that you can go out and do your core business, serve your principal function. And I think it's a very common thing for associations to lose sight of that and end up just sort of managing themselves for the sake of managing themselves, or it's, you know, one constituency trying to make sure that the other doesn't get what they want at their expense and so on. And so it just ends up being a kind of permanent stalemate. And I mean, there are all kinds of problems with that. You don't get a lot done. You lose good people because I don't think that bright, talented policy people are really up for that. Shifting that mindset, turning the organization into one that was focused on the outside world was probably the thing that I was most concerned with in the first sort of 90 days. And I think the group and the membership have responded really, really well to that. Once you articulate it in that way, nobody disagrees with you. It's just, you know, habits and a culture that build up slowly over the years, and it's no one's fault in particular. But when you come from the outside, you see it immediately. And the most important thing that I needed to do in those first days and weeks was start to change that. Yeah.
This is the part of association management that just is not fun. This is not something that people want to build their career doing, I think. But I think one thing that you're doing now is you actually making working at associations seem pretty cool. Like it's a fun job.
You know, when I was first approached about doing this other association job, long time ago, first of all, I was probably way too inexperienced to be doing it. I'm still not sure why I was asked. I mean, I started my career quite late. I traveled through my 20s, and I didn't start really till I was about 30. And I think I was 35 when I was offered this job as DG of I think we were 13 people or so at the time.
What association was this?
It's called Euro Heat and Power. So it's the Association for District Heating and Cooling. And by the way, they're doing great work without me. They've really it's great to watch, actually, when you leave a job, to watch them continue and develop. But I was asked about that, and I remember thinking about it. Do I really want to do this? Do I really want to leave? I was, growing up in this company, promotions and growth, and it was a difficult decision to walk away from that. And I remember having dinner with an old friend who'd been sort of a mentor to me in previous jobs. And he'd been Secretary General at another association. And he said to me, just do it. You're going to love it. It was probably the most important conversation I had when thinking about this. If he hadn't said that the way that he did when he did, I'm not sure I would have done it. But he was right. It's such a privilege to do this kind of work.
And that's what you'd say to other people if they're in a similar position.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I was younger, I thought that, I started in a consultancy, then I worked in a small association, then I went to this big company. And I think I thought I'd really made it. I think I thought that's what you were supposed to do. That's the trajectory. And, if I'd stayed another couple of years, I'd have had a very fancy title in a really big office and all that stuff that doesn't matter at all. And as you get a bit older and you start thinking about what you really value in your work life, I mean, I'm sure other people have a great time in these large companies, but if I'm honest about it, when I talk to friends and peers, I think people in my job tend to be happier. And I'm pretty sure that's borne out by these sort of satisfaction studies that are done. I think it's great fun. Of course, you need the right place, you need the right people, you need the right board, all that stuff. Otherwise, it doesn't work. But when you have those things, it's a good job.
Yeah. So we had Wouter Vermeulen here talking about what members expect from a secretariat. I'd like to look at that from the other angle. If you knew somebody who was about to take on a position for the first time as a board member of an association, what advice would you give them?
Let's see. First of all, I would talk to them about being involved with associations for the right reasons. And it isn't just getting what you want as a person or as a company. The best board members and the best members generally are people who approach the inevitable kind of discussions and internal negotiations that happen in a spirit of compromise. And you don't see it with everybody, but you see it with some people. And when you find it, it's fantastic. People who just intuitively understand that they're not going to get everything that they want. That's the nature of it. Just as the person who disagrees with them isn't going to get everything that he or she wants. So coming into the room with an open mind and an idea that you will have to negotiate and compromise, that's something. Then, I think that members should be demanding of their associations. I think that the standards should be high. One of the real traumas probably in my career, in my first week in my previous trade association, we had a board meeting. And board meetings, there are always background documents that get sent out a few weeks before. So there were these documents, and I'd had nothing to do with them because I wasn't in the job yet. And I got them and looked at them, and I was not particularly thrilled with the quality for various reasons. I just didn't think they were very good. And I said so to one of my board members. Just said, I'm a little uneasy about this. We have this meeting. I wouldn't have sent out these documents, and I don't think they help very much. And he looked at me and said, oh, don't worry about it. It's always like that here. This was a really formative experience. I can tell you, we had the board meeting the next day. It kind of went okay. And the day after that, I sat the team down and told them this story and said, I cannot imagine that you guys are comfortable with anybody thinking about us this way. Where's our sense of pride? And they reacted really well to that. Of course, people don't want to be thought of that way. It happened. It can also be explained by the fact that there was a kind of gap and maybe a lack of leadership for a few months. So it's nobody's fault in particular, but I was really bothered by that. I don't want to work in an organization that has that type of reputation. So I think board members have every right and even a responsibility to push the secretariat, but it should be done in a way that's kind of fair-minded and reasonable and constructive. I've seen associations that are basically destroyed by unreasonable, inappropriate pressure from the board. And this doesn't help. So you got to find that balance between pushing, but only insofar as it helps and makes things better. And you need to help create an environment where people feel they can do their best work. Over the years, I've often said, if the organizations where I've been have performed quite well, I hope, it's mostly because the people I work with do the business, deliver. And I like to think that part of the reason they're able to do that is because I work quite hard to create the space for them to work without fear, without anxiety.
Yeah.
And it's a board member's responsibility to help contribute to that kind of culture.
Yeah. It's almost as if they need to become a different person or at least adopt a very different mindset.
Yes.
If they're working in a corporate role, if they're a CEO, they have people reporting to them, they ask for something to be done and it gets done.
Yeah.
Or if they're an entrepreneur, that as well, but everything's moving really fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not like that at associates.
It's not like that. And it can sound like excuses. When you tell a CEO, well, I understand that you want that, but politics, basically, they, there's a look that they get, like, don't give me this bullshit. I said I want it. And like so many other things, actually dealing with that kind of problem is fine if they trust you. You know, if you can look someone in the eye and say, well, I know you want that, but you're not going to get it, and here's why. If you're credible, if they think, he knows better than I do about this, I better listen, it's fine. If they think that you're not totally competent or you're not confident, you're in big trouble. If you appear hesitant or uncertain, then they will just think, well, this guy's not pushing hard enough, and we'll get rid of him, or we'll shout until he's sufficiently motivated.
I guess part of that comes down to just telling the truth.
Yeah, it comes down to being comfortable enough in your own skin to tell the truth. Yeah. You know, and I mean, you also reach an age and a stage in your career where, you know, I don't get frightened. I mean, in a way that maybe I remember being a very junior policy officer, and I was terrified. You know, I had a boss who frightened me, and you know, you sort of get over that at some point. And also, like, if I can be kind of relaxed and confident when I talk about our work, it's also because the people I work with really are superb. And I know everyone says this about their team and so on, but we really do have an exceptional group of people. And as I say, a large group of people, which gives us, you know, scale and muscle to do some quite heavy lifting. So when my guys tell me some things like this, yeah. I believe them. I'm quite sure they're right. And it's easier then to go to my board and say, well, this is how it is, and this is what we can do about it, but this is what we can't do. It won't work. It's not possible. And for that, I mean, I'm grateful every day to the team that I work with.
It's a good principle. I think we're getting at the importance of soft skills at associations, but as well, it's clear to me that life is too short to be economical with the truth, or not to give the full picture. Yeah. And overall, it
doesn't help.
No, it doesn't help.
It might get you through the day, but it won't get you through the month. And I don't see the point. I mean, and you're wasting your own time and other people's time.
Yeah. I get the sense as well that your team is one of the big motivators for you.
Yeah.
And we spoke about the difference between the corporate world and the association world. Associations are smaller.
Yeah.
Which means there are fewer opportunities for growth and development. And so the motivation isn't always about you work this hard, you're going to get the promotion.
Yeah.
Or even the pay rise sometimes. So how do you keep people motivated?
Yeah, I don't think many people leave their jobs over money. It can happen. And it's never been my objective to keep everyone at all costs. My objective is to make sure that anybody who leaves us leaves because they want to go towards something that they're really excited about, an opportunity that's so good they can't say no. You know, years ago, I worked in this small gas association, and they'd sort of said to me that I could take over as the DG. And again, I was way too young and way too inexperienced to be doing it. But I was kind of thinking about it because Bonnie and I wanted to buy our first apartment and all this stuff that's a concern when you're in your early 30s. And then I was offered this job that I ended up going to at a company called Voss. And the offer was so good, the opportunity so big for me at that stage, that when I showed it to my boss, he looked at me and said, I'll drive you to the airport. And it meant a lot to me because it was a pain in the ass for him, me leaving. Yeah. I know, but he didn't think about that. He thought that this is something this young guy has to do. And with my team, I don't like to lose our people. And I'm really happy to say that so far the turnover has been really, really low. People stay. But if there are opportunities that they just have to take, they should take them. What I cannot live with is the idea of people leaving us because they can't stand it anymore, because we don't treat them properly, and so on. And money's part of that. I mean, and we have to remain a competitive employer. You know, I've seen what happens with inflation, what's happened with inflation the last couple of years, and particularly for the younger people, this matters a lot. You know, I still remember very well what it's like to have to pay rent and to find that the salary that you get is just about enough maybe to cover your costs for the month. So these things are really important. Money matters, and they have a right to be compensated for the good work that they do, but there's so much more to it than that. I mean, I think treating people decently, and just as importantly, creating a culture where everybody feels and understands that where people are incentivized to treat their colleagues well. Because it's fine for me to be a certain way, but if people who are more in middle management don't handle our younger people well and so on, then there's not much good talking about culture. I think treating people well, trying to behave like a decent person. I mean, one of the nice things that has been said to me over the years by employees is that I'm a human sort of manager and people leader. I mean, it's funny that people should
There'll be another way of doing it.
People should need to articulate that, but I think I know what they mean. I mean, I do take a real interest in people as individuals and try to create a culture where we all treat each other decently. I think that's a big part of it. Then the other thing is, career opportunities and so on. I don't think it's a secret. I can probably say it. When I arrived at European Aluminium, I found a lot of very talented people in their sort of early 30s who were struggling to find space for themselves. And there's a big difference between someone who's 33 and has 7-8 years experience now and a kid who's just starting out. At some point, they're not kids anymore. Yeah. And either you make space for these people and you need to shuffle the organization around and change the culture, or they go. I've been really gratified to see that people not only have been willing to stay, but able to grow and take more responsibility. And that's the best thing in the world, to watch somebody grow from being a promising junior to somebody you really rely on, a senior member of the team. And again,
that's gratifying.
Extremely. And again, we're lucky because we're big enough and sufficiently well funded that we, it's easy to say this type of thing. If you have 4 staff, it's a lot harder. There's no question. My life's made easier by the fact that we have quite a big structure, but it's still a challenge every day. And I think all the time about, I'm constantly going through this process in my head of thinking about each colleague. And I also have one colleague who's our head of operations, who I've kind of moved into something like HR. You could probably call her, I never would, but you could probably call her our chief happiness officer or something like that, who really, really helps me.
You're not ready to embrace the funky titles
yet. Come on. But the substance of it is fine. She helps me all the time when I'm doing a kind of mapping of how everybody is and whether they're comfortable and what we've said to them about their development and are we keeping our promises to them and so on. It's important. And I think if you do those things, it's you can't keep everybody happy all the time, but you can have an environment where people broadly feel positive.
So a lot has happened at European Aluminium. What's your objective now? Let's say in 3 years' time, what would be a picture of success for you in terms of the state of the association?
Yeah, I think we're still refining some things structurally. I've talked to you about creating space for these kind of early to mid-career professionals. A lot of that was just kind of removing walls in the structure to make space. At some point, I think there'll be a second phase where we probably go through a bit of restructuring what was destructured, if you see what I mean. As I see, how people are evolving. Now I understand these people as individuals much better than I did 18 months ago. So I don't doubt that over the next couple of years we'll keep refining our structure. But I think the type of culture that we wanted to establish, it's there, and I just want to kind of live with it for a few years now and let it do its work. On the substance side of things, we need to get through this kind of valley of death that we're in right now. There is, I think, a longer term future for this industry in Europe based on an increasingly clean energy model that can actually make us more competitive. If Europe invests sufficiently in building out the infrastructure that's needed for a clean energy system, I can see how this works out very well for us and how we can thrive in Europe. But in the meantime, it's hard. And that involves a lot of discussions about helping us through this period, not because we need help, because I don't expect the policymaker to care about that, but because we really will be needed in order to achieve their ambitions. And that's that the next 5 years, the next Commission administration, the next parliament. I think that's going to be the most fundamental question we have. How do we continue to work on climate without letting industry leave Europe?
One thing you're articulating very clearly is that this industry needs a strong association.
Yeah.
And that's probably the same for most industries.
I believe so. Yeah.
More so than ever, I think.
Yeah, but the stakes are higher than ever.
Yeah.
Probably there. I don't know. We must have gone through periods of relative kind of optimism and prosperity. You know, I think of the years when I started. I mean, I finished my master's. I started working in kind of 2005, 2006. It was quite a heady time because we'd gotten over the economic shock that came post 9/11. And there were a few years before the financial crash in, when was that, 2008, where a lot of things seemed possible. I mean, I think I was lucky to start my career in what was, in the end, quite a short window of good times.
Yeah, I just missed it.
Yeah. and I remember thinking, you know, had I come 2-3 years later, things would have been harder. Because when I started, you know, traineeships were still kind of falling from the ceiling. I mean, I got one in a few days, and I mean, I had very little to offer at the time, I can tell you. But I sort of found my way. And now everything is difficult. And I mean, we may be getting a little bit beyond my remit, but we are, I think, to an extent, looking at some warning signs about a kind of structural decline in the West that is going to make life harder for our civilization, and to come back to associations. There's a lot at stake, and we will have more of these kind of existential challenges to deal with, and getting organized and having an organization that can articulate your needs and interests has to be more important than ever, I think.
Absolutely. And looking out the window, looking at the big world out there, getting ready to embrace and engage with that.
Yeah, instead of just emailing each other.
Okay, that's the message from this podcast. Less email, more getting stuff done.
Yeah.
Paul, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.